Many people speak on guys like Nolan Richardson, John Thompson III being powerful black coaches in their era, who were pioneers in fighting for equality and opportunities, more opportunities for black coaches in their era. Besides Leonard Hamilton, who favors them in regards to being successful in fighting for that same equality for black coaches in this era? And how can black coaches in general do a better job of not tearing each other down, competing against each other, and being more unified to create more opportunities?
Jabari Johnson, founder of the Heads Up Foundation here in Dallas, Texas. We do mentoring, nonprofit leadership, sports, educational, and scouting. Great question. Many people think of John Thompson, Leonard Hamilton, Nolan Richardson. Some of the modern day guys I think are doing a good job of carrying the torch. You have to start with, of course, Frank Hayes with Tulsa doing an outstanding job of using his platform. So is Ron Hunter over at Tulane. You got Kelvin Sampson at Houston, and Mike Boyne over at Oklahoma State. You know, black coaches are severely misrepresented at college basketball. So these guys do a great job of speaking out and letting their voices be heard. And not only that, but educating the player, educating the young men that come through their program. So those are some of the names that come to mind. And as far as the fighting for equality, again, some of those same names come to mind, you know, but you got Anthony Grant, LaVelle Moulton is another name out there who's doing an outstanding job. Then you got some of the younger head coaches, Jawan Howard, who's the first black head coach in the Big Ten, getting ready to do an outstanding job with his platform as well. So, and as far as tearing down one another, I mean, the statistics are against black coaches as it is. So that ought to be enough to do a better job of pulling each other up instead of tearing each other down. So those are just my thoughts on that. Thank you, Brian.
In regards to the topic of social justice, Black Lives Matter, and equality, what would you like to see from your white counterparts in our lane and space of college basketball?
Pete Schwethelm, I was a college coach for 10 years. I've been running camps on the periphery of college basketball for the last 10. I wrote a book called Recovering Racist. You guys are all welcome to check it out on Amazon.com. Thanks, Brian. At this point, and of course, if you're on this call, it probably doesn't apply to you, but at this point, if you misunderstand what Black Lives Matter means, it's deliberate, it's willful. And so I remember, for example, the first time I heard the phrase white privilege, and this was maybe 5 years ago. I'd never heard it before in my life. And I've had lots of setbacks and misfortune and so on and so forth. And so that didn't sit right with me when I first heard the term. But then about 45 seconds later, I Googled it. And I read the article by Peggy McIntosh that coined the phrase or popularized the phrase in about '88. And then I wasn't hurt anymore. And so on the topic of Black Lives Matter or any other brand or topic, if you feel yourself getting uncomfortable as a white person, I just encourage you to go to Google and try to educate yourself, because a lot of times once you do that, then the hurt feelings and the misunderstanding lessen substantially. So I think that the key is self-education, and I've said a lot of times that what we as white people need to do is twofold, and that is listen to black people and talk to white people. It's not enough only to listen. We also need to use our voice and talk to our own to try to move the needle. Because at the end of the day, we can't live our ideals as a nation until we move past racism. And racism is a white issue that affects black people. But it's up to us as white people to fix the topic of racism. And until we do, we're never going to live up to the ideals we're supposed to as a nation. So that's about all I got.
What does Black Lives Matter mean to you, and in what ways can whites use their privilege to make a difference?
Well, as other people have said, Black lives have not historically mattered in America from not our inception, but 150 years before our inception. And it was frustrating to me I touched on this earlier, but at this point, if you're misinformed as a white person, it's at least to a certain extent on purpose. And white people tend to get the benefit of the doubt in the US, whereas like Black Lives Matter was presumed to mean only Black Lives Matter or Black Lives Matter more. Yet another example on a long list of situations where Black people don't get the benefit of the doubt. There's no reason for white people not to say, oh, I bet that means Black Lives Matter also, or Black Lives Matter too, or why don't Black Lives Matter? But instead we got defensive based on generational brainwashing, at least generational racism, and we got extremely sensitive about it. And the nice thing is that, and like what's easier than an American white man to feel hopeful? I have seen a lot of things though in the last couple of months that have been unusual. Hundreds of police chiefs putting out statements. I never saw that before. And so today, it's probably in the 30% range of white people who are pissed off about the phrase Black Lives Matter. Whereas 3 months ago, it was probably more like 50%. And so I really hope that the thing I want more than anything else, because in the 60s, Dr. King spoke about how most of the white allies of that era, they were on board because they were outraged about the treatment of Black people, not because they were committed to the long-term equal opportunity for Black people. And these, of course, are different topics. And I hope we don't do the same thing again. I really hope that this time, because in 64 and 65, we passed Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, and the vast majority of American white people were like, we did it. We did it. And now we can move on with our lives. And they jumped right back into what King called the white moderate zone, where they were no longer committed. So this time, I hope we're going to get some congressional resolution. They're going to pass something related specifically to police brutality. And my great hope is that this time, the white people who are on board with reform don't over-congratulate ourselves once we get a small sliver of reform that's one step forward. And what was your second question again?
What can whites do to use their privilege, the white privilege that we spoke on, to make a difference?
Well, I touched on this earlier as well to a certain extent. White people need to listen to Black people and speak to white people. And someone else said earlier that oftentimes it's easier. So like if a Black person tries to engage with a white racist, anything the Black person says could be misconstrued as an excuse. Oh, y'all are the culture of victimhood and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, right? Like all of that whole narrative. Whereas when a white person confronts a white racist, well, it's very hard for them to look at us and say, oh, you're buying into a culture of victimhood and da-da-da-da-da-da, and where are all the Black fathers and da-da-da-da-da, like and all of that type of stuff. And so it's super important for us as white people, an element of privilege is we can engage other white people without being sort of universally shot down based on pre-existing racist narratives. You know, I hear like it's so common for, you could almost say that like the three things that white people cling to, white racists in particular, although Yusuf mentioned earlier, and I agree, that all American white people are racist to some extent. There's just a scale in play, right? You don't need to be a cross burner in order to be a racist. And I consider myself to be a racist, I might add. There's just a 1 to 10 scale like any other human attribute, right? Like just because you're not Hitler doesn't mean you're not a racist. So I hope that we as white people quit engaging in self-issued comparative clemency, where we imagine that we're not a racist because someone else is more racist. But some of the things I hear most commonly are, slavery's a long time ago, I never enslaved anyone, and it's time to get over it. And when you hear those types of things from white people asking you to get over it, I'm curious how you respond and how you feel.
Well, my response to getting over it, and you kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, anybody that's saying that at this point is pretty much being deliberate with it. So I would say they need to be educated. I would direct them to, powerful documentaries done by Ava DuVernay, such as 13th, the documentary 13th, that talks about, how we're still, slavery has been abolished except for when you're in prison. And mass incarceration has been one of those major things in the Black community that, has been disproportionate. And so, you look at 13th, When They See Us, I Am Not Your Negro. These are some of the movies that Blacks, whites, everybody needs to educate themselves on, because it gives you a greater understanding of what we're dealing with. We're not, yes, slavery ended. Then we had to deal with Jim Crow. Jim Crow ended, and we're still fighting for some of the same equality today in 2020 that we were fighting back then. So, my response is get educated.
And just to piggyback on that for 1 second, to give everybody listening one stat to consider. In 2011, Bank of America was fined $335 million, a record fine, for flagrant systemic discrimination against Black people. We're talking about identically, mathematically, equally qualified Black bars being offered either higher rates, less money, or being outright rejected. And so to any of you white people out there that hear that it was a long time ago, bullshit, 2011 is not a fucking long time ago. And this isn't just about police brutality. It's about banking, education, housing, employment. There's not a facet that doesn't touch. And it's not a long time ago. And we've made some progress, but since when is progress the main focus? We're all coaches. So if we're making progress, we're up 10 points in the second quarter, are we like, we did it? Well, of course not. Right? We have not reached the top of Justice Mountain, not even close. And so it was not a long time ago, and progress isn't the point.